They told her to sign the papers. They told her a woman had no business running a cattle ranch alone. They had already written her out of the story before she even had a chance to speak. But Evelyn Cross didn't come this far to fold. What you're about to hear is a story about land, loyalty, and one woman's fight to keep everything she'd bled for, against a man who believed the law was something he could buy, and a town that had already decided whose side it was on. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Cross nearly lost Iron Ridge Ranch, the sky came up the color of a bruise. She noticed it from the kitchen window. That sick purple-orange crawling over the eastern ridge like something wounded dragging itself up. And she stood there with her coffee going cold in her hand, watching it, because some part of her understood that this day was going to hurt. She just didn't know yet how many different ways. It was the 14th of October, and she had until noon. That was what the letter said. The one that arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered by Frank Hooper's boy on a horse that needed its shoes done. She'd read it twice standing in the yard, the paper trembling slightly in the dry wind, and then she'd folded it carefully and put it in the tin box she kept under the floorboard in the bedroom. The same box where she kept Marcus's last letter, his pocket watch, and the deed to this land. The Lease Board of Harlan County hereby notifies Mrs. Evelyn Cross that per the provisions of the original Rowan Cross Land Agreement, a review of ranch operations will be conducted on the morning of October 14th. Failure to demonstrate adequate management of the Iron Ridge property may result in transfer of operational authority to the next eligible party as designated under the original terms. The next eligible party. She didn't need to read the name, she already knew it. Silas Rowan, Marcus's cousin, second removed. A man who wore his ambition the way other men wore cologne. You smelled it before he even walked into the room. He'd been circling this land for 2 years, ever since Marcus's heart gave out in the South Field on a Tuesday afternoon in August, with no warning and no goodbye. Just gone, the way some men leave, sudden and permanent and without any of the words that needed saying. Evelyn set her coffee cup down on the counter with more force than she intended. It made a sharp crack against the wood, and she stood very still for a moment, breathing. She was 34 years old. She had 17 head of cattle, down from 42 when Marcus died. She had 400 acres of rangeland, most of it dry, a quarter of the east fence line that needed replacing, a barn that leaked in 3 places, and a reputation in Harlan that had been quietly, methodically dismantled over the past 24 months by a man who never once raised his voice when he was doing it. That was the thing about Silas. He smiled when he destroyed you. She went outside. The ranch yard in early morning had a particular quality of silence that Evelyn had come to think of as the ranch breathing, the way the dust settled, the way the horses shifted in the paddock, the low sound the wind made coming down off the ridge. She used to share it with Marcus, those first quiet minutes before the day started. Now she shared it with no one, and she had learned to find something in that aloneness that wasn't quite peace, but was at least honest. She walked the perimeter of the yard the way she did every morning, checking gates, checking water troughs, checking the lean-to where she kept the tools. The east fence problem nagged at her. 3 sections down, posts rotted at the base, wire rusted through in places. She'd spent 2 weeks trying to repair what she could with what she had, but it wasn't enough. Anyone who walked that fence line today was going to see exactly what the lease board would call inadequate maintenance, and that language would go directly into Silas Rowan's waiting hands. She stopped at the gate and looked out toward the road. Empty. Dawn light coming slant across the dry grass. A hawk riding thermals above the canyon rim. She didn't know why she expected anything. She wasn't waiting for anyone. There was no one coming to help. She'd made sure of that, or rather, Silas had made sure of that for her, slowly and carefully, over the course of 2 years, nudging conversations at the feed store and the church social and the town meeting, planting small doubts the way you plant seeds, patient and deliberate. She's struggling out there, poor woman. Marcus left things in worse shape than anyone knew. She doesn't have the experience for this kind of operation. Someone needs to step in before she runs the whole thing into the ground. He never said she couldn't do it. He was smarter than that. He just kept saying she shouldn't have to, and somehow those 2 things ended up meaning the same in people's minds. Evelyn turned back toward the barn. She had a list. She always had a list. Today's list was short and brutal. Mend what fence she could before 9, document every repair she'd made in the past month with dates and specifics, get the cattle count confirmed, and be standing in this yard at noon when the board members arrived, looking composed and capable, and not like a woman who'd been awake since 4 in the morning, worrying herself half to death. She was pulling on her work gloves when she heard the sound on the road. It was a horse, one horse, coming from the north at a walk, not rushing, not even particularly purposeful, just moving the way an animal moves when it's been going a long while and has learned to pace itself. Evelyn shaded her eyes. The rider was a man, lean and medium height, dressed in the kind of clothes that had been washed many times and had lost their color to the washing. A dun-colored jacket, a hat with a dent in the crown that looked like it had been sat on at some point. He sat the horse easily, not showing off, not slouching, just settled into the saddle the way people get when they've spent a long time moving from one place to another. And there, in front of him on the saddle, tucked against his chest with his arm around her, a child. Small. Maybe 7 or 8. Brown-haired, her face half hidden by the brim of a too large hat that she'd clearly borrowed from someone much bigger. They came up the road slowly, and the man stopped his horse at the gate without being asked, waiting to see if he was welcome before pushing through. Evelyn appreciated that. More men than she'd like to admit would have just ridden in. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She kept her hands at her sides. "You lost?" "No, ma'am." He glanced at the gate, then back at her. "Saw the ranch from the north road. Wondered if you might need a hand." "What kind of hand?" "Ranch work, whatever needs doing." Evelyn looked at him more carefully. Mid to late 30s. A scar along his jaw that had healed a long time ago. Hands that had worked. She could see that even at this distance, the way the knuckles were shaped, the slight permanent curl of the fingers. He didn't smile trying to sell himself. He just sat there and let her look, which was either very confident or very tired. "That your daughter?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am, Rosie." The child turned her face slightly at the sound of her name. She had dark, watchful eyes that were doing exactly what Evelyn's eyes did on this road every morning, taking inventory, noting everything. "She doesn't talk," the man said. Not apologetically, just stating it. "Hasn't for a while. But she doesn't cause trouble, and she stays where I put her." Evelyn looked at the little girl for a moment. Rosie looked back without blinking. "What's your name?" Evelyn asked the man. "Cole Mercer." "Where are you from, Cole Mercer?" A pause. "Most recently, New Mexico territory." "And before that?" "Various places." She'd heard that kind of answer before. Men passing through gave answers like that, vague, geographically accurate, but emptied out, offering direction without detail. Usually it meant something they weren't discussing, and usually that something was one of 3 things: a woman, a debt, or a bad history with someone who had a long memory. Evelyn should have sent him away. It was a bad morning to be taking risks. The lease board was coming at noon, and she needed to look like she had things under control, which she emphatically did not. And the last thing she needed was a stranger in her yard giving Silas more ammunition. She thought about all of this in about 4 seconds. "Get down," she said. "I'll show you what needs doing." His name was Cole Mercer, and he didn't offer much else. He tied his horse to the paddock fence and set Rosie down with a gentleness that Evelyn noticed and filed away. The way he checked that her feet were under her before he let go. The way he handed her a small cloth bag from the saddlebag without her asking for it. The brief nod they exchanged that meant something between them she wasn't part of. Then he turned to Evelyn and said, "What's most urgent?" "East fence line," she said. 3 sections down. I need them standing by noon." "Stakes?" "In the lean-to. Wire too, though not enough." She hesitated. "I may not have enough to do all 3 sections properly." "Show me what you have." She showed him. He looked at the wire and the stakes and the post digger and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I can shore up 2 sections solid. 3rd one I can make look right if someone doesn't walk it close." "Someone will walk it close." "Then we do 2 sections solid and make the 3rd one honest." She looked at him. "Meaning what?" "Meaning we don't try to hide what's broken. We make it clear it's on the repair list with a date on it and the materials already purchased." He shrugged. "A board that's looking to find fault will find it either way. Better to look like you know what your problems are and have a plan than to look like you're trying to cover something up. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You know about lease boards? I know about people looking for reasons, he said simply. She didn't ask him to explain that. All right, she said. Let's go. They worked the east fence line in the early morning while the light was still merciful and the heat hadn't built. Cole worked without needing direction. He'd pull a post, check the ground, set the new one, and have it tamped before she'd finish stringing wire on the previous section. He wasn't fast in a showy way. He was just efficient, without wasted motion, which was actually better. Rosie sat on a flat rock near the fence line and watched. She had a small piece of cedar wood in her hands, smooth, pale, with one edge darkened as if it had been in a fire. And she kept turning it over in her fingers the way children fidget with things. Every so often, she'd look up at the land around them with those dark eyes, scanning the ridgeline and the canyon rim and the dry grass with the focused attention of someone who expected to find something. At 8:30, Evelyn heard hooves on the north road. Not the sound of the lease board. That would come from town, from the south. This was different. She straightened up from the fence wire and turned and felt the familiar cold drop in her stomach. Silas Rowan. He came with two men she recognized, Danny Keach, who worked his ranch, and the other one, a heavy-set man named Cord, whose last name she'd never been told. They rode across the front of her property with the easy confidence of people who believe they're already inside something that belongs to them. Silas himself was 41, broad through the shoulder, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of permanent suntan that came from 30 years working land in this country. He was handsome in the way that some dangerous things are handsome. The kind of face that made people want to trust him before they'd thought it through. He pulled up at the fence line and looked at Cole, then at Evelyn, then back at Cole with an expression that managed to convey several things simultaneously without actually saying any of them. Evelyn, a nod, the smile. Early morning out here. It is, she said. I see you've got help. His eyes moved over Cole once more, slowly, the way you appraise something at auction. Didn't know you were hiring. Didn't know I needed to announce it. Silas's smile didn't waver. It never did. Just making conversation. He looked at the fence line, at the sections they'd repaired, at the third one with its honest, documented brokenness. Board's coming at noon. I understand you're aware. I'm aware. I just wanted to stop by to say, and here his voice shifted into something softer, something almost kind, which was always the tell, that there's no need to make this difficult, Evelyn. I've spoken to the board already. If you were to indicate willingness to transfer management, just the management, not the title, not yet. It could be framed as a mutual decision, something dignified. You could stay on the property. It doesn't have to be, no, she said. Silas blinked. Not because he was surprised, she'd said no to him before, but the quickness of it seemed to land differently today, like she'd moved to a different place in herself since the last time he'd tried this. Evelyn, I said no, Silas. I'll see the board at noon. She held his gaze. If you're planning to be there, that's your right, but I'd appreciate you leaving my fence line. The smile again, a slow breath. He gathered his reins. Your choice, he said. It's always your choice. He looked at Cole one last time. Friend, he said, by way of nothing in particular. Cole Mercer looked back at him and said absolutely nothing. Silas turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, his two men trailing. Evelyn didn't let herself exhale until the sound of them was gone. That's him, Cole said. Not a question. That's him. Cole looked at the road where the dust was still settling. He'll be back at noon with better ammunition than that. He always is. A sound from behind them. They both turned. Rosie was standing now, off her rock, facing not toward the road where Silas had ridden, but toward the south. Toward Split Rock Canyon, far off behind the south pasture. She wasn't pointing. She wasn't doing anything dramatic. She was just standing there with that piece of burned cedar in her hand, looking south with an expression that on an adult would have been called troubled. Rosie, Cole said quietly. The girl turned back, sat back down, went back to turning the cedar in her fingers. Cole watched her for a moment, then turned back to the fence without saying anything. Evelyn watched them both and said nothing either. There were 6 people on the Harlan County lease board, not counting Silas, who was not officially a board member but had been attending their sessions for 18 months, with enough familiarity that he might as well have been. They arrived at noon precisely. Martin Hale, who chaired the board and ran the grain mill on the south edge of town. Dorothea Vance, who was the only woman and who had always been technically civil to Evelyn while making it perfectly clear she found the whole situation inconvenient. Frank Birch, the county recorder, and 3 others whose names Evelyn knew but whose faces had all begun to blur together into a single expression of reluctant duty. Silas arrived with them. He'd changed his clothes since the morning. He was wearing his good jacket. Evelyn was standing in the yard when they rode in, which was intentional. She'd chosen her position carefully, not on the porch, which would have looked defensive, like retreating to her own doorway. Not too far out in the yard either, like she was trying too hard. She stood at the edge of the yard where you could see both the barn and the paddock and the repaired fence line, because she wanted the first thing they saw to be the work, not just her. Cole had taken himself to the barn. She'd asked him to be present, but not prominent, which he'd understood without her explaining further. Rosie had not gone to the barn. Rosie was sitting on the top rail of the paddock fence, watching the road, still holding that piece of cedar. Martin Hale dismounted first. He was 70 years old and moved like it, and had the permanently suspicious expression of a man who'd been in charge of things long enough to expect they would go wrong. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mr. Hale." She shook his hand. "Thank you for coming." He looked around the yard with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen a lot of ranches and knew what good management looked like and what struggling looked like, and was currently in the process of sorting this one. "Let's have a walk." The walk took 40 minutes. Evelyn had prepared documentation. She'd spent 3 evenings writing it up by lamplight, her fingers cramping, going back over every repair she'd made and every decision she'd logged since Marcus died. Dates, materials, costs, outcomes. She handed the folder to Frank Birch, who was the record keeper, and she watched him flip through it with an expression she couldn't read. At the east fence line, Martin Hale stopped and looked at the 3rd section, the honest one, the documented and in progress one. "This section," he said. "Materials are on order," Evelyn said. "The repair log is in the folder Mr. Birch has. Ordered 3 weeks ago, delayed at the Harlan Supply Depot. I have the receipt." Hale looked at the fence, looked at his board members, looked at the receipt Frank Birch was holding up. "It's there," Birch said, a little grudgingly. Silas was standing slightly behind Hale's shoulder. "One section of fence doesn't tell you much about the state of the whole operation," he said pleasantly. "But the cattle numbers might. 42 head when Marcus died, 17 now." He paused to let that land. "That's not a maintenance problem. That's a management problem." Evelyn had been expecting this. She'd been dreading this for 2 weeks, actually, because the numbers were real and she didn't have a clean answer for them, and she'd learned that the worst attacks are the ones that have some truth in them. She looked at Hale. "May I respond?" "Of course," Hale said. 7 of those animals died in the winter of last year," she said. 3 of them I sold at market. The records are in the folder. 5 were lost to what the county vet recorded as wolf depredation. "Or incompetent grazing management," Silas said, still pleasant, "and the remaining 8 have been missing since late summer." She paused. "Which I have not categorized as dead. I've categorized them as missing, because I don't have a body or a credible explanation, and I'd rather be honest about what I don't know than put a number in a column that I can't support." Martin Hale was looking at her now in a slightly different way. Not warmly, she didn't think warmth was in his range, but with something that might have been attention. "Missing how?" he said. "That's what I'd like to understand," Evelyn said. "And I think if you give me a fair chance to demonstrate what I can do with this ranch, the answer may become clearer." "Or it may become clearer that Silas is right," Dorothea Vance said crisply from the back of the group. "It may," Evelyn said, "but I'm asking for the chance to find out." There was a silence. Silas stepped forward slightly, and the move was smooth and practiced, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "The board's time is valuable," he said. "We all know what the numbers show. We all know what the land looks like. Evelyn is a brave woman. No one's saying otherwise. But bravery and capability aren't the same thing, and this board has an obligation to the land itself, not just a sentimentality about who's standing on it." He didn't look at Evelyn when he said it. He looked at Hale. Evelyn felt the old anger start up in her chest. That particular heat that had no good outlet, that she'd learned to press down and convert into something useful because there was no point in showing it to men who would only use it as evidence. She pressed it down now. "I'm not asking for sentiment," she said quietly. "I'm asking for the same standard you'd apply to any ranch manager with 2 years of documented work, an honest maintenance record, and 8 head of cattle that may be stolen rather than dead. That's what I'm asking for." Hale looked at her for a long moment. "We'll discuss," he said. They discussed in the yard while Evelyn went inside and made coffee she didn't drink. She stood at the kitchen window and watched them. 6 people in a rough circle near the paddock fence, Martin Hale doing most of the talking while the others listened and occasionally added something. Silas had been asked to step back, which was a small thing, but she noted it. He stood near his horse with his arms folded, and from this distance she couldn't see his expression, but she could read his posture, which was the posture of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. Cole came in through the back door. He pulled off his hat and set it on the table and stood there for a second, which was about the longest he'd been still all morning. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She turned from the window. "He's been working them for months. Hale might be honest, but he's cautious, and cautious people tend to go with the path that makes the most sense on paper, and on paper. On paper, you're short cattle and the fence is damaged." "Yes," Cole nodded. He wasn't trying to make her feel better, which she appreciated. "The missing cattle," he said. "When you say missing, disappeared from the south pasture late August, maybe into September. I found part of a fence cut at the south edge, near the canyon. Not broken. Cut." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Rosie found something this morning," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "Near the feed barn. Tucked into a gap in the foundation, a piece of leather." He reached into his jacket pocket and put something on the kitchen table, a small scrap of dark leather with a distinctive pattern of cuts along one edge. "I don't know what the mark means, but Rosie found it, and she wouldn't let me leave it." Evelyn picked it up. She looked at it for a long moment. "This is a rebranding stamp cover," she said. Her voice came out flat. "You use it to hold a branding iron steady when you're reworking an existing mark. The cuts in the edge are from the iron fitting." Cole said nothing. "Someone was branding cattle on my property," Evelyn said, "or brought equipment here for it. Or left it here on purpose," Cole said. "In a place someone searching the property would find it." She looked up at him. "Who was the board going to find this?" she said slowly. "If they searched the property as part of the review, which they were going to do." Evelyn set the leather piece down carefully. Her hands were very steady, which surprised her. "He was going to let them find it," she said. "Let them find evidence of branding activity on my property, without any cattle to account for it, and let them draw the conclusion that I was the one doing something wrong." Cole said, "That's how I'd read it." Outside, she heard Martin Hale's voice rise slightly, not in anger, but in the way voices rise when something is being decided. She looked at the leather piece on her table and at Cole Mercer standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and no stake in this except the one morning's work she'd given him, and she made a decision that she knew was either very smart or very stupid, and wouldn't be sure which for a long time. "I need to show this to Hale," she said, "right now, before he finishes whatever conclusion he's building." "It'll put you in the middle of a story you can't finish today," Cole said. "You don't have proof of what it means yet. You have a piece of leather. I know. You might think you're manufacturing a distraction." "I know that too." "Okay," Cole said. He picked up his hat. Martin Hale looked at the leather piece for a long time. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it in Evelyn's hand, with Frank Birch and Dorothea Vance flanking him, and the rest of the board fanned out in a rough half circle. Silas had moved closer during the presentation, slowly, the way water moves, without announcing itself. "Found where?" Hale said. "Foundation gap on the east wall of the feed barn," Evelyn said. "Discovered this morning. I believe it's a rebranding cover. Used to steady an iron when working over an existing mark." "You believe," Dorothea said. "I know what it is," Evelyn said. "What I don't know is how it got there, or what it was used for. I'm asking for time to find that out." Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "This is... Martin, you can see what's happening here. She's produced a piece of trash she found on her property, and she's trying to spin it into a..." "I didn't ask for your commentary, Silas," Hale said. A beat of silence. That small thing, Hale cutting him off, was the first indication Evelyn had that the morning might not be entirely lost. She kept her face neutral. "What I'm asking for," she said, "is a 30-day extension on the review, not an indefinite delay. 30 days to complete the east fence repair, to investigate the missing cattle situation, and to provide the board with a full accounting." She looked at Hale directly. "If after 30 days the numbers and the evidence still don't support continued management, I'll accept the board's decision." "And if they do support it," Frank Birch said, "then I'd ask the board to recognize that." Another silence, longer this time. Silas's posture had shifted. Less folded arms, more weight on his back foot. A small thing. But Evelyn had spent 2 years learning to read the small things. 30 days, Hale said finally. He said it to the board, not to Evelyn. "This review is continued. The property remains under Mrs. Cross's management pending the extended review." He looked at Evelyn. "You have 30 days. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post, and in his movement he turned slightly away from Silas, which was the most pointed thing Evelyn had seen a man of his restraint do in years. The board mounted and rode out. Silas stayed. He stayed until the sound of the board's horses had faded, until it was just him and his 2 men and Evelyn in the yard, and then he turned and looked at her with the first expression that wasn't managed. The first real one, the one underneath the smile. 30 days, he said. "That's right. You think you can find something in 30 days that changes anything?" "I think I can find the truth," she said, "and I think you're worried about what that looks like." His jaw worked once, that was all. Then the smile came back like a curtain being drawn. "Good luck, Evelyn," he said, and rode away. That evening, after the horses were fed and the yard was quiet, and the last of the sun had dropped behind the western ridge, Evelyn sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea that had gone cold without her noticing. Rosie was in the yard, crouching near the edge of the garden plot, examining something in the dirt. She'd been doing that for 20 minutes, not playing, not wandering, just looking, with the patient intensity of a creature that had learned the world held things worth finding if you were willing to take time with it. Cole came out of the barn and stood in the yard for a moment, watching his daughter. "She do this a lot?" Evelyn asked. "Always," he said. He came to the porch and leaned against the post. "She sees things other people walk past. Always has. Must be useful." "Sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. "When did she stop talking?" Evelyn looked at him. "When my husband died," she said. She stopped. "Wait, you meant Rosie." Something passed over Cole's face. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent. "Yes, I meant Rosie. But if you want to talk about the other thing, that's your call." Evelyn looked at her cold tea. 2 years ago, August. He was in the south field checking on a heifer that had gotten stuck in the drainage ditch. His heart. She turned the cup in her hands. They found him in the afternoon. He'd been there since morning. Cole said nothing, which was the right response. "I was in town," she said. "That's the part that doesn't leave. I was at the general store arguing about whether they'd gotten my order of fence staples right, and he was—" She stopped. "Anyway," Cole nodded. "My wife left," he said after a moment. Not in the same key exactly, but adjacent to it, the way 2 people sometimes end up in the same territory from different directions. "She didn't die, she just stopped wanting to be where we were. Took off one morning when Rosie was 4. He looked at his daughter in the yard. Rosie saw her go. She was standing at the window. After that," he shook his head. "Doctors called it selective mutism. Said she'd come back to it when she was ready. It's been 3 years. Rosie looked up from the dirt, found her father's eyes across the yard. He nodded at her, and she went back to what she was looking at." "What's she looking at?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know. She's been finding things today." He pushed off the post. "That piece of cedar she had earlier, she picked it up from the south pasture, the burned end. She wouldn't put it down." Evelyn looked at the yard, at the south pasture beyond the fence line, at the line of the canyon rim far off in the deepening dark. "The south pasture is where I found the fence cut," she said, "where the cattle went missing." Cole followed her gaze. "Yeah," he said. Rosie was still crouching in the dirt. Her fingers moved over something on the ground, a mark or a pattern, or something in the soil that adults walking through would have called nothing and stepped on. "Cole?" Evelyn said slowly. "When you rode in from the north this morning, did you come through the South Range at all?" "No, came direct on the road." "Then she picked that cedar up on this property, somewhere between the gate and the barn." "Yes." Evelyn set down her cold tea, stood up. "I need to look at where she found it," she said. They found the spot before the dark was complete, a patch of bare ground near the post of the interior gate that connected the yard to the south pasture, where something heavy had rested for a while. The earth was pressed flat in two distinct patterns, like feet or like runners. And in the dirt, faint but present to anyone looking, a half-circle mark, like the heel of a branding iron that had been warm when it rested there. Not Evelyn's brand. She crouched over it with the lantern Cole held, and she looked at it until her eyes ached, and she thought about 8 missing cattle and a cut fence line and a piece of rebranding leather hidden in the foundation of her barn. "He was using my property," she said, "moving the animals through here, using this gate to get them south toward the canyon." "At night," Cole said, "when you couldn't see." Evelyn sat back on her heels. The lantern light threw shadows across the ground, across the mark in the dirt, across Rosie's face as the child crouched next to her, looking at the same mark with those dark, steady eyes. "How long?" Evelyn asked. Not of Cole exactly, of the night. No one answered, which was honest. She looked at the canyon rim, the dark line of it against the darker sky, and thought about what might be down there, hidden in the folds of Split Rock Canyon, behind a gate no one had reason to look for. She thought about 30 days. She thought, it might not take that long, but she didn't say it out loud because she'd learned, slowly and painfully over the past 2 years, that the distance between what you hoped and what you could prove was often the most dangerous ground of all. She picked up the lantern and stood. "First light," she said. "We look at the south pasture fence line, every inch." Cole stood, Rosie stood. The three of them walked back to the house in the dark, the lantern making a small circle of light that moved with them, and behind them the mark in the dirt waited to be found again, patient as the land itself, keeping the truth the way the land always kept it. Buried, but not gone. Never gone. The south pasture fence line was 1.25 miles long, and they walked every foot of it. Evelyn went first, moving slow, eyes down, checking each post for signs that weren't weather damage. Not the natural lean of wood working loose in dry soil over years, but the specific kind of disturbance that happened when something had been moved deliberately and then put back to look like it hadn't. Cole followed a few steps behind, doing the same thing with a different set of eyes. Rosie walked alongside the fence itself, trailing her fingers along the wire the way children drag their hands along railings, except she wasn't playing. She was reading. It took them 2 hours to cover the stretch from the interior gate to the canyon-facing corner, and by the time they reached it, Evelyn had found 4 things that bothered her. The first was a post near the 1/4 mile mark where the wire had been reattached with staples newer than the surrounding ones, bright metal where everything else had oxidized to dull gray. Someone had cut this section and restrung it after. They'd done it carefully, but they hadn't aged the hardware, and Evelyn had been walking this fence long enough to notice. The second was a patch of ground near the 1/2 mile mark where the grass had grown back thinner than it should, the kind of recovery you got after hooves had churned the soil repeatedly over weeks, a trail that had healed over but not completely. It ran parallel to the fence for about 20 feet, then angled toward a gap between 2 old juniper trees that she'd never thought twice about. The third thing was the gate, or what had been a gate, hidden between the junipers, set back from the fence line so it wasn't visible unless you were standing at a specific angle. A crude wooden frame with a wire panel that swung on leather hinges. Old, weathered to match the surrounding brush. But the leather hinges were oiled, recently. Cole crouched next to it without touching it. "How long has this been here?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "I don't know if Marcus knew about it. It could have been here for years. Someone's been using it." "Yes." The fourth thing was what Rosie found about 6 feet past the gate on the canyon side. She stopped walking and pointed down, and when they came to look, they found a scrap of leather about 2 inches wide with a pattern of small cuts along one edge. The same pattern as the piece Cole had found at the feed barn foundation. Not identical, but from the same set. Like someone cutting a template and leaving scraps as they worked. Cole picked it up. Held it next to the piece he'd been carrying in his jacket since yesterday. Fit them together, and the cut patterns matched almost exactly. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He was rebranding them here, Evelyn said. On my property, before moving them south into the canyon. Cuts down on the distance you're moving marked cattle, Cole said. If anyone spotted the herd on the road, they'd already be wearing the new brand. You just look like a rancher moving his own animals. Evelyn looked through the juniper gate toward the south, where the canyon dropped away from the pasture in a series of broken shelves and dry washes. Split Rock Canyon went deep, 3 miles at least of tangled ravines and narrow corridors that she'd never had reason to explore. No water down there worth bringing cattle to. No grazing to speak of. Everyone in Harlan County knew that, which was exactly the point. I need to go down there, she said. Cole looked at the canyon. It's rough country. I know what it is. I've lived next to it for 8 years. I'm not saying you can't handle it. I'm saying it's going to take a day, maybe 2, to do it right. And you've got 29 days on your extension, which sounds like a lot until you're spending 2 of them in a canyon that might have nothing in it. It has something in it. You believe that. I believe it, she said. But belief and proof are different things, and I know that. Cole stood up from his crouch. He looked at the scrap of leather in his hand, then at his daughter, who was still standing at the gate opening, staring south down into the canyon's broken geography with that particular stillness she sometimes had. Not the stillness of a child waiting to be told what to do, but the stillness of a creature that had already decided something and was simply waiting for the humans to catch up. We go tomorrow, Evelyn said. First light. Cole nodded. He didn't argue it further, which she was beginning to understand was his way. He stated his concern once, clearly, and then let you make the decision without making you feel the weight of his having disagreed. Marcus had not been like that. Marcus had been a circler. Someone who came back to the same concern 3 or 4 times from different angles until you either convinced him or gave in. She used to find it exhausting. Standing here now, she found herself missing it with a sharpness that surprised her. She turned away from the canyon and walked back toward the ranch. That night, Silas came to town. Evelyn didn't know this until later, but the account she eventually pieced together from 3 separate people went like this. Silas Rowan arrived at the Harlan Hotel around 7 in the evening and took dinner with 2 men in the back room. Not a private meeting, exactly, but a backroom conversation, the kind where you're not hiding, but you're not advertising either. One of the men was Douglas Fenn, who sat on the town council and had been a Rowan family ally since before Evelyn had arrived in Harlan. The other was a man no one recognized. Traveling clothes, a leather case, the look of someone who moved between towns for professional reasons. The woman who cleaned the hotel rooms told her neighbor, who told the postmaster's wife, who told Evelyn 3 days later, that she'd heard the word appraisal through the wall more than once. A property appraisal meant someone was pricing something for sale or pricing it for transfer. And the only property in Silas's orbit that wasn't already his was Iron Ridge Ranch. He was moving faster than 30 days, which meant he was either very confident in the outcome of the review or he was planning to make the outcome irrelevant. Evelyn sat with this information in her kitchen on the second evening and looked at the leather scraps on the table and thought about what it meant to be outpaced by someone who had more patience and more resources and didn't need to be right. He just needed to make her wrong. You're doing that thing, Cole said from across the table. She looked up. What thing? Where you go somewhere in your head and your face goes flat, like you're not in the room anymore. I'm in the room. You're calculating something. She looked at him. He was drinking coffee, which he did without ceremony. No warming his hands on the cup, no savoring it, just drinking it. Like fuel. She'd noticed that about him in 2 days. He treated most things like fuel. Food, sleep, rest. He took what he needed and moved on. He's had someone doing a property appraisal, she said. While I've got 30 days on the clock, he's already pricing the land. Cole set down his cup. So he thinks the review goes his way. Or he's planning to make it go his way. Meaning what exactly? Meaning, I don't know, but he's been 3 steps ahead of me for 2 years, and I keep reacting to what he does instead of... She stopped, pressed her fingers flat against the table. I'm tired of reacting. Cole was quiet for a moment.
Then don't, he said. Go south tomorrow like you planned. Find what's down there or don't find it, but stop waiting to see what he does next. It wasn't complicated advice. She knew that. But sometimes you needed to hear a thing said out loud by someone with no skin in the game, just to locate it again. Thank you, she said. He shrugged. It's not a complicated situation. It just looks complicated because you're in the middle of it. From the small room off the kitchen, the spare room where she'd put a cot for Rosie, there was the quiet sound of the girl shifting in her sleep. They both listened for a moment, and then, when it settled, went back to the map Evelyn had unfolded on the table. She'd hand-drawn it years ago, the canyon topography as best she could reconstruct from what she knew. There wasn't a good map of Split Rock Canyon in the county records. No one had needed one. She put her finger on the first shelf break where the pasture dropped away. If he's keeping cattle down there, he needs water and some kind of level ground. There are 2 places I know of. She traced 2 routes. Both take about 3 hours to reach from this side. We split it? No, we stay together. I'm not going to find a hidden herd and then have no witness. Cole looked at her for a moment. That's smart. I have my moments. The next morning, Evelyn went into town alone. She had a reason. She needed to pick up the fence staples she'd been waiting on, and she needed to see Frank Birch at the recorder's office about documenting the leather findings properly, because she'd decided that whatever she found in the canyon, she wanted a clear paper trail going in, not just coming out. She'd been the kind of person who documented things since Marcus died, not because she was naturally organized, but because she'd quickly discovered that the moments when you most needed proof were always the moments you hadn't thought to make any. Harlan was a town of about 400 people in the valley between 2 dry ridges, and it had the particular quality of small frontier towns where everyone knew your business but pretended they didn't. Walking the main street, Evelyn could feel the awareness of her, people noticing without looking, conversations that shifted slightly in register when she passed the hardware store, the way Nell Birch glanced up from her sweeping and offered a smile that was slightly warmer than it needed to be, which meant she'd heard something and felt guilty about it.
She went to the recorder's office first. Frank Birch was 62, methodical, and had the recorder's particular virtue of caring about documentation for its own sake, independent of what the documentation proved. He'd been in this office for 20 years, and he treated evidence the way a pharmacist treated medication, precisely, without interpretation. She showed him the leather scraps. He put on his glasses and examined them for a long time without speaking. "Where exactly did you find these?" he said. She told him. Dates, locations, circumstances. He wrote it down in the ledger he kept for property matters, asking clarifying questions that were precise and unemotional. When she described the gate and the junipers, he looked up from his writing. "You're saying there's an access point in your south pasture fence that predates your management." "That's what it looks like." "And you believe it's been used to move cattle?" "I believe so. I'm going to look at the canyon tomorrow to see if there's any evidence supporting that," Birch wrote. His pen made a dry, scratching sound on the ledger page. "You understand," he said without looking up, "that what you're describing, if accurate, would represent a significant criminal matter, not just a lease dispute." "I understand." He looked up. "I'm telling you that because it means the standard of evidence changes. A lease board looks at operations. A criminal matter needs something more specific." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." He nodded, wrote something else, dated it, signed it. Then he made a second copy and handed it to her. "That's your record," he said. "I keep mine here." He paused. "Mrs. Cross, I want to say I've kept my distance from this situation because I work for the county and the county operates the lease board, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to take sides." "I understand that." "But documentation is not taking sides," he said carefully. "Documentation is just the truth written down in a place where it can be found." She looked at him. He was already looking back at his ledger. "Thank you, Frank," she said. He made a small sound that wasn't quite a response and went back to writing. She was crossing the street back to her wagon when Silas stepped out of the land office. The timing was either coincidence or it wasn't, and Evelyn had stopped believing in Silas's coincidences about 18 months ago. He saw her immediately. Of course he did, and crossed toward her with his hands easy at his sides and the morning smile already in place.
Evelyn. He fell into step beside her, which she didn't invite and couldn't easily stop without making a scene in the middle of the street, which he knew. Silas, how's the ranch holding up? Fine. Good. A pause. I heard you had some people out looking at the south fence yesterday. She kept walking. I walk my fence line regularly. That's what good management looks like. Of course. He was quiet for a half step, which was when she knew something was coming. I heard you found something. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. His face was the same. The smile, the warmth, the concern. Where'd you hear that? She said. Oh, you know how towns are. He gestured vaguely. People talk. I don't put much stock in gossip. Someone had been watching. She'd known it was possible, but knowing it and feeling it were different. She thought about who'd been near the south pasture the previous morning. No one she'd seen, but that meant nothing. The canyon rim offered a view of the pasture from the south side that you could hold for hours without being visible from the fence line. I found what I found, she said. If you're curious about the details, you can ask Frank Birch. I've documented everything. Something moved in his eyes. Not alarm, more like a recalibration. That's very organized of you, he said. I've learned to be. She started walking again. Evelyn? His voice was still pleasant, but there was something underneath it now, a slight pressure, like a hand on a door that isn't supposed to open. I want you to think about what you're doing, not the fence line, not the review, what you're actually doing. Chasing a theory into rough country, involving people you don't know, spending your 30 days on a... Silas. She stopped again, turned fully. I am not having this conversation in the middle of this street. I just think... I know what you think. Her voice was quiet and completely flat. I have known what you think for 2 years. What I'm doing is managing my ranch and pursuing a legitimate investigation into missing livestock, and that is exactly what this extension was granted for. So whatever you were going to say next, keep it. She walked to her wagon without looking back. Her hands were shaking when she got in. She put them in her lap and breathed until they stopped, because there was no point in shaking, and she didn't have time for it. On the third morning, they got up before light. Cole had the horses ready when she came out of the house. Her bay mare and his dun, both saddled, the saddlebags packed with water and a day's worth of food, and the rope they'd need if there was any climbing involved. Rosie came out behind Evelyn, already in her boots, with her hair braided roughly the way it always was, and the piece of cedar from the south pasture tucked into the pocket of her jacket. Evelyn had debated whether to bring the girl. She'd thought about it the previous evening, and then thought about it again lying awake at 2 a.m, and eventually arrived at the same answer both times. Rosie had found everything that mattered so far, and leaving her behind felt less like protection and more like arrogance. You stay close, she told her. Rosie looked at her with those steady eyes, the look that wasn't agreement exactly, but was acknowledgement. They rode south. The pasture in pre-dawn was silver and cold, the grass stiff with a thin frost that wouldn't last past sunrise. The juniper gate in the south fence line was standing when they reached it, looking smaller in the dark than it had in daylight. Cole swung it open with one hand and held it while Evelyn rode through, then Rosie behind her. Then he followed and latched it, and they rode on down the first shelf break into the canyon. The canyon did something to sound. The open pasture had the usual frontier silence, birds, wind, the creak of saddle leather. But below the first shelf break, the walls started closing and everything changed register. Sounds came back at you off the rock faces. The horse's breathing was louder. The world got smaller and harder. Evelyn had ridden into Split Rock Canyon twice in her years at Iron Ridge, once with Marcus to look for a heifer that had gotten through a fence break, and once alone in the first spring after he died for no reason she could fully explain, maybe just to be somewhere that had nothing to do with the thing she needed to do. She'd found the canyon empty both times. Good hiding country, she'd thought, just not hiding anything. They followed the eastern wall of the canyon for 2 hours, moving carefully on the rocky ground, watching where the horses put their feet. Cole was behind her, giving her the lead, which she appreciated. This was her land and her knowledge, and she wanted to be in front. The first water source was a seasonal pool in a rock basin at the 2-mile mark. She'd thought about this one first because of the level ground surrounding it. About 3 acres of relatively flat canyon floor, the kind of accidental geography that could hold a small herd if you had feed supplementing the dry grass. The pool was empty,
the ground around it undisturbed. She checked anyway, crouched down and looked at the soil for the pressed-in patterns of hooves, ran her hand along the base of the canyon wall, feeling for anything soft or new. Nothing. Cole was watching her from the saddle. He didn't say anything. "Second spot is further," she said. "Another mile. Tighter canyon. You want to eat first?" "No." They rode on. The second water source was different from the moment she saw the approach. The ground changed 100 yards out. Not dramatically, not obviously, but she was walking her horse slowly enough to see it. The soil was disturbed, not just by weather, the kind of disturbance that happened when many hooves crossed the same ground repeatedly over days or weeks. The dry grass was flattened in a fan pattern, pointing toward the narrowing of the canyon walls ahead.
Cole saw it too. She knew because he straightened in his saddle without her saying anything. They slowed the horses to a walk and came around the last curve of the canyon wall and stopped. The canyon opened into a hidden pocket, maybe 5 acres, maybe 6, bowl-shaped and sheltered from the wind. A natural pool fed by a seep in the far wall, ringed with salt grass. And on every foot of that grass, and around that pool, and pressed against the canyon walls in the dusty shade, were cattle. Not 8. Not 15. Evelyn counted fast, heart knocking, and got past 30 before the animals started shifting and making it harder. Her bay mare felt the tension in her hands and moved sideways, and she steadied the horse with one knee and kept counting. 38. 40. 43. 43 cattle in a hidden canyon pocket, 3 miles from her south pasture gate. She made herself look at them. Really look. Not just count, but examine. Head shapes, coloring, the size and conformation of the animals. Looking for something specific. Looking for what you could see if you knew Marcus's brand, if you knew the particular notch pattern he'd used on left ears for his best breeding stock. The brands on these animals were Rowan brands. She could read the mark from here. RR. Silas's cattle mark, clean and fresh on hide that still showed the slight raised texture of recent work. But underneath some of those brands, barely visible, on the animals who'd been marked longest ago and whose new brand had set most completely, she saw it. The original scar. The ghost of what had been there first. An old burn healed to smooth, slightly discolored skin beneath the new mark. The shape of Marcus's brand, the iron her husband had used for 12 years, the mark she'd watched him press into hide dozens of times. Her cattle, her stolen cattle, rebranded and hidden in her own canyon, 3 miles from her fence line. Rosie made a sound beside her, not a word, but a sound. The first one Evelyn had heard her make since she'd arrived, a short exhale with something in it that might have been recognition. Evelyn looked at the girl. Rosie was looking at the cattle with her dark eyes, and her hand was pressed flat against her jacket pocket where the piece of cedar was. "I see them," Evelyn said softly, not just to the girl, to herself, to whatever part of her had been holding 2 years of doubt and suspicion and grief all at once and needed somewhere to put it down. "That's enough to see," Cole said quietly, behind her. "But we can't hold it." "I know. He'll move them if he knows we found—" "I know, Cole." She pulled her mare back from the edge of the bowl. Her mind was already moving, already building the sequence of what had to happen next. Witnesses, authority, public. Everything in the open where it couldn't disappear the way truth had a habit of disappearing in private. But the canyon was 3 miles from the nearest road, and Silas had men who watched her fence line, and 30 days was suddenly a very long time when you knew exactly where the evidence was and how fast it could vanish. She turned her horse back toward the canyon entrance. "We ride hard," she said, "and we don't stop in town. We go straight to Martin Hale." Cole turned his horse alongside hers. "What about Silas?" he said. "If he finds out you've been here, he's going to find out regardless." She looked at Cole over her shoulder, and something in her had settled into a different kind of stillness than she was used to. Not the stillness of holding herself in, but the stillness of something that had stopped waiting and started moving. "The only question is whether he finds out after I've already put the right people in that canyon." They rode hard back up through the canyon's broken geography, the horses picking their way fast through the rock and the dry wash, Rosie holding her mare steady with a grip that surprised Evelyn, the pale morning light coming in angles off the canyon walls, and the sound of 43 cattle lost and found behind them,
waiting in a hidden bowl of rock and salt grass and stolen time. 3 miles up and out, back through the juniper gate, across the silver pasture in the growing light. She didn't look back. There was no point in looking back. But that night, 2 hours after they'd ridden north, 2 hours after Evelyn had kicked her horse into a gallop across the open pasture and not once considered pulling her pace, something happened at Iron Ridge Ranch that she would not discover until morning. Someone burned the branding rack, not the barn, not the house, just the rack. The iron frame Marcus had built in the first year of the ranch, the one she'd used every spring, the one that stood in the east yard where everyone could see it. Someone came after dark and burned it to the ground and left the iron bones of it standing in a pile of ash. And they did it without a sound that anyone inside the house heard. And next to the ash pile, pressed into the ground just hard enough to be deliberate, was the heel print of a boot Evelyn recognized. She'd seen that particular shape, narrow toe, flat heel, a small star-shaped repair on the left side, outside her kitchen door 3 weeks ago when Silas had ridden in for the first time to talk her into signing the papers. She stood in the cold morning looking at the ash of a thing that had stood for 8 years, and she understood exactly what this was. It was a message, and it was a frame, and it was both at once. Destroy something of hers so she looked damaged and unstable to the board, and leave just enough to suggest it might have been her own doing, some desperate act, some sign of a woman losing her grip. She stood there in this cold and the ash and the quiet and felt something move through her that wasn't rage and wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It was clarity, the kind that only came when someone had pushed so far past decency that there was nothing left to be confused about. "Cole," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He was already standing in the barn doorway, looking at the same ash pile she was looking at, a cup of coffee in his hand and his face doing the particular thing it did when he was assessing something serious. Absolutely still, absolutely present. "I see it," he said. "Document it," she said. "Everything, every inch. We don't touch it, and we don't clean it up." And then she looked at the ash that had been her branding rack, and at the boot print that had been left for her to find, and at the pink edge of dawn coming over the eastern ridge. "And then we go get Martin Hale," she said, "and we bring him here before Silas Rowan gets the chance to decide what this means." Martin Hale did not like being woken before breakfast. Evelyn knew this because his wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Clara, said so directly when she opened the door and found Evelyn standing on the porch at 6:45 in the morning with mud on her boots and Cole Mercer behind her, and a look on her face that apparently communicated enough that Clara stepped back and called her husband's name up the stairs without asking any further questions. Hale came down in his suspenders with his coffee and his bad mood and looked at Evelyn the way he looked at everything before 8 in the morning, which was with deep suspicion of its necessity. "Mrs. Cross?" "Mr. Hale, I need you to come to my ranch. I was just there 2 days ago. Something's happened since then." She kept her voice even. "Someone burned my branding rack last night. The frame's still standing, the boot print's still in the ash. I need you to see it before anything disturbs it." Hale looked at her over his coffee cup, then at Cole, then back at her. "Burned," he said. "Yes, sir." "Your own branding rack?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the same calculation she'd worked through standing in the ash at dawn. What it meant, who it pointed to, what a reasonable man was supposed to do with it. Hale was cautious and sometimes slow, and had the institutional inertia of a man who'd run things long enough to distrust urgency. But he was not dishonest. She'd always believed that about him, even when his caution had worked against her. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. Clara was already handing him his jacket. They rode back to Iron Ridge in the early morning with Hale and Frank Birch, whom Hale had insisted on stopping for because Birch was the county recorder, and anything that went into the official record needed Birch's eyes on it first. Birch had taken this with his usual equanimity and brought his ledger. The branding rack stood in its ash pile exactly as Evelyn had left it. She'd made Cole and Rosie come inside and stay there so there'd be no question of disturbance. The boot print was still pressed clear into the gray ash near the south edge of the pile. The narrow toe and the star-shaped repair on the left heel, exactly as she'd seen it at dawn. Hale crouched over the print for a long time without speaking. Birch documented it, measurements, description, a careful sketch in the ledger margin.
Cole stood in the barn doorway and watched without contributing, which was the right instinct. "You said you recognized this print," Hale said finally. "I believe I do. I saw it outside my kitchen door approximately 3 weeks ago. I didn't document it at the time because I had no reason to." She paused. "I document things now. I didn't always. That's something I've had to learn." Hale looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, still not that, but something that might have been a recalibration of his previous reading of her. "Who does it belong to?" he said. "I believe it belongs to Silas Rowan. I won't say I'm certain, because I'm not, and I don't want to put something in your record that I can't support." She met his eyes. "But I'd ask you to consider who benefits from my branding rack being destroyed 2 weeks into a management review," Birch wrote. Hale stood up from his crouch, and his knees cracked doing it, and he made the face people made when their bodies reminded them of their age. He looked at the ash pile for another moment. "This isn't enough on its own," he said. "I know, but it's not the only thing I have to show you." He looked at her. "There's more?" he said. "Yes," she said. "And for that, I need to ask you to ride south with me, into the canyon." Hale looked at the sky, looked at Frank Birch, looked at his horse tied to the paddock fence. "How far south?" he said. 3 miles. He made a sound that was not enthusiasm. "Claire's going to have my breakfast cold by the time I get back." "I know. I'm sorry for that." He put his hat on. "Let's go." The ride into Split Rock Canyon the second time was different from the first. The first time, Evelyn had been running on urgency and instinct, and the particular sharp focus that came from finding something you'd been looking for without knowing you were looking. This time she was aware of every minute passing, every step the horses took, every sound the canyon walls threw back at them. Because this time she had witnesses, and witnesses could be lost, and the ground she was taking them to could be empty by the time they got there. She hadn't told Silas they'd been in the canyon, but someone had burned her branding rack, which meant someone had been watching, which meant the canyon might already be... She stopped that thought. There was no use in it until she could see for herself. Cole rode up beside her on the second shelf break, where the canyon walls started closing in, and the light changed quality. "You're riding like you're trying to outrun something," he said quietly. "I'm trying to outrun the possibility that there's nothing left to find when we get there. If it's empty, we have the leather scraps and Birch's documentation and a boot print. That's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's something." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, picking his horse's path through the rock. "You're not trying to make me feel better," she said. "I figured you'd rather know what you actually have." "I would," she said, and meant it. They came around the last curve of the canyon wall, and Evelyn pulled her mare up and looked into the hidden bowl and felt the breath go out of her in a way she hadn't expected. Not a gasp, not a sob, just a simple deflation of something she'd been holding tight for the past 4 hours. The cattle were still there. 43 head, some standing, some lying in the shade of the West Canyon wall, exactly where she'd left them the previous afternoon. The pool was churned at the edges from overnight drinking. The salt grass was grazed back around the perimeter. The canyon smelled of animal and dust, and the particular dry mineral smell of the rock seep. Behind her, she heard Martin Hale make a sound that she couldn't categorize exactly, something between surprise and a reluctant kind of recognition. The sound a cautious man makes when the evidence does something he wasn't expecting. "That's a lot of cattle for an empty canyon," Frank Birch said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is." She rode down into the bowl ahead of the others. The cattle shifted but didn't bolt. They were settled here, had been settled here long enough to be used to the space, which told her something about how long they'd been hidden. She moved her horse slowly through the outer edge of the herd, reading brands, counting, doing what she'd done yesterday, but now with Hale and Birch behind her and the weight of what she needed them to understand sitting on her like something physical. "Come look at this one," she said. She'd stopped beside a 3-year-old red steer near the center of the herd. One of the older acquisitions, she thought, based on how thoroughly the new brand had set. She got down from her mare and knelt beside the animal's flank, and it was a measure of how settled this herd was that the steer only shifted slightly and didn't pull away. She ran her hand over the RR brand mark. Let Hale come close enough to see. Fresh brand, Hale said. Look underneath, she said. Feel here. She guided his hand, which he allowed, slowly, to the slightly different texture of skin beneath the new burn. The old scar, healed to a different density than the surrounding hide. The ghost shape of what had been there first. Hale's hand went still. He crouched lower, putting his eyes close to the hide. Birch was beside him, ledger already open. The ghost brand was unmistakable once you knew to look. A running M over a bar. Marcus Cross's iron, the mark he'd filed the design for in the same county recorder's office 11 years ago. That's Marcus's brand, Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Underneath the Rowan mark, on my cattle, in my canyon, 3 miles south of my property line. She stood up. And I have leather scraps from 2 locations on my fence line that match a rebranding template set documented by Mr. Birch before we came down here. And I have a boot print in the ash of my burned branding rack that I believe belongs to the man who organized this. Martin Hale stayed crouching for a long moment. His hand still rested on the steer's flank. Birch was writing. Then Hale stood. And this time, when his knees cracked, he didn't make the face. He just straightened up and looked at the herd around him, and then at Evelyn with an expression she had not seen him direct at her before. Not quite apology. A man like Hale didn't apologize easily, but something adjacent, something that acknowledged a debt without stating it. We need the county sheriff, he said. Yes, sir. And we need this canyon secured before anyone moves these animals. Yes, sir. Frank, he said, turning, you're going to need a bigger ledger. Birch looked up from his writing. I have one in the saddlebag. Get it. They sent Cole back up to the road to ride for Sheriff Lynn Pruitt, while Hale and Birch stayed in the canyon. Evelyn stayed too, because she wasn't leaving these animals in anyone's custody but her own until there was law present, and Hale didn't argue with that. They stood in the canyon bowl in the late morning warmth, and Birch documented every animal he could get close to, brand over brand. The ghost marks visible once you knew the technique, the older ones clearer because time had separated the texture of the 2 burns. Rosie sat on a flat rock at the canyon entrance. Evelyn had told her to stay near the opening and call out if she heard anyone coming from the north, from the ranch side. The girl had gone to her post without a word, the piece of burned cedar still in her jacket pocket. It was Rosie who heard them first, not a call. She didn't call out. What she did was stand up from her rock and face north up the canyon, with her body gone rigid, the way an animal goes rigid at a scent, and Evelyn saw her from 50 feet away and knew what it meant. Someone's coming, she said. Hale's head came up. How do you... Her, Evelyn said simply, and started walking toward the canyon entrance. She heard the horses before she reached Rosie. 2, maybe 3, coming down the first shelf break at a pace that wasn't careful. Coming fast. And then the sound resolved and she recognized the gait of the lead horse because she'd been listening to that particular horse move around her fence line for 2 years. Silas. He came around the canyon curve with Cord behind him, and a third man she didn't know, and he pulled up when he saw Evelyn standing in the canyon entrance with the girl beside her. His horse danced sideways at the abrupt stop, and he steadied it with a practiced hand, and his face did a complicated series of things in the space of about 2 seconds before settling back into something arranged and controlled. Evelyn, he said. Silas. His eyes moved past her into the bowl. She didn't turn to see what he was registering. She knew what was in there. She watched his face instead. Watched him see Hale and Birch among the cattle. Watched something that might have been calculation or might have been something closer to fear move through his expression before he locked it down. What's Martin doing in this canyon? He said. His voice was still level, still conversational. His job, Evelyn said. I don't understand what that means. I think you do. He looked at her. The smile was gone now. Not replaced by anger, not yet, but by something colder and more deliberate that she hadn't seen before. The face underneath the face. She'd been waiting 2 years to see it and found it wasn't satisfying. It just looked like a man doing arithmetic. You're making a mistake, he said. Whatever you think you found down here, I know what I found. Cattle stray. Cattle cross property lines. Finding animals in a canyon doesn't mean... Silas. Her voice was quiet and hard. Martin Hale has been in that bowl for 2 hours looking at my dead husband's brand under your iron. Frank Birch has been writing it down. The sheriff is on his way. She looked up at him on his horse. Whatever you were going to say next, I'd think carefully about it. Cord shifted behind him. The third man's horse moved sideways. Silas looked past her into the bowl again. Hale had turned and was watching now. Birch too. The weight of those eyes, official eyes, recorded eyes, seemed to land on Silas differently than Evelyn's did. She watched him feel it. I want to speak with Martin, he said. You can do that when the sheriff arrives, she said. Until then, I'd ask you not to come further into this canyon. You don't have the authority to. Martin, Evelyn said without raising her voice. Hale walked toward the canyon entrance. Slow, deliberate, the way he did everything. He came up beside Evelyn and looked at Silas Rowan on his horse. And the silence between the two men was a particular kind of silence. The kind that happened when one person has been caught in a thing and both of them know it, and neither one has decided yet what form the next moment takes. Silas, Hale said. Martin. I don't know what she's told you, but whatever evidence she claims, I've seen it myself, Hale said. I've put my hand on it. Another silence. Shorter. More final. I'm going to need you to wait at the canyon entrance, Hale said, until Sheriff Pruitt arrives. That's not a request. Silas looked at Hale for a long moment, then at Evelyn. His horse moved under him, that restless shifting of an animal that felt the tension in its rider's body. This is not over, he said, to Evelyn, not to Hale. I know, she said. It's not over yet. He pulled his horse back. Cord and the third man followed. They retreated to the curve of the canyon wall and stopped there, and Evelyn could feel their presence at her back for the rest of the wait, like a pressure between her shoulder blades that she forced herself to ignore. Len Pruitt arrived with 2 deputies an hour and 40 minutes after Cole had ridden out. He was a compact, sun-weathered man of 50 with a deliberate manner and the useful quality of not visibly reacting to things until he'd had enough time to understand them. Cole had caught him at his office, and he'd come without asking for more than a sentence of explanation, which told Evelyn either that Cole was persuasive or that Pruitt had already been forming his own questions about certain things in Harlan County. He went into the canyon bowl and spent 30 minutes there with Hale and Birch. Then he came back out and stood at the entrance and looked at Silas Rowan sitting his horse at the curve of the canyon wall. Silas, he said, why don't you come on down and we'll talk? What followed was not fast. None of it was fast, and Evelyn had understood by this point that it wasn't going to be. The law moved at its own pace, and evidence had to be processed in sequence, and Silas Rowan had enough standing in this county that even with a canyon full of rebranded cattle, the conclusion of things would take time. Pruitt was methodical and fair, and he questioned everyone, including Evelyn, which she had expected and prepared for. Silas said the cattle had wandered from his north range through a gap in the fence line, and he'd been in the process of arranging their return. He said it smoothly and without visible panic, which she had to grudgingly acknowledge was impressive. He had a prepared version of events, which meant he'd considered this possibility, which meant some part of him had known this day might come. But Cord made a mistake. It was a small one, the kind that happened when a man who wasn't the principal player in something got nervous and started trying to explain too much. Pruitt was talking to him near the canyon entrance, routine questioning, and Cord said unprompted that he'd never been to the South Pasture fence line, and Pruitt asked him why he'd mentioned the South Pasture fence line when no one had brought it up, and Cord's face did something that no amount of composure could undo. Pruitt noted it in the way that experienced lawmen noted things, without expression, without reaction, just quietly filed. Evelyn watched all of this from 20 feet away, where she'd been asked to wait, standing next to Cole and Rosie in the thin afternoon shade of the canyon wall. She watched Cord's face do its complicated thing and watched Pruitt's face do nothing in response, and felt something shift in the balance of the afternoon. He's going to need more time to put it all together, Cole said quietly. I know. The cattle stay here until then, under Pruitt's authority. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. You did it, he said. She looked at him. Don't do that yet, she said. This isn't done. No, he said, but you found them. That matters. She looked at the canyon bowl. at her cattle, at her property's stolen inventory standing in the afternoon light with the double brands on their hides, waiting to be properly claimed. At Marcus's mark underneath Silas's mark, the old truth underneath the new lie. The way things often were. Buried, but present. Waiting for someone to look close enough and long enough to find it. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel relieved. She felt tired in a way that went all the way down, and underneath the tired was something she didn't have a name for yet. Not happiness exactly, but the thing that existed in the space where fear had been living for 2 years and had finally been asked to vacate. Rosie moved next to her. The girl had been standing still for an hour, doing what she always did, watching, reading the scene with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Now she moved, and what she did was take the piece of burned cedar from her jacket pocket and hold it out toward Evelyn. Not to give it to her, just to show her. Evelyn looked at the cedar, looked at the child's face. Rosie's expression was complicated in the way children's expressions were when they understood something that adults were still catching up to. Not satisfied, not happy, but with the particular gravity of someone who had been carrying a piece of knowledge and was watching the world finally arrive at the same place. Evelyn took the cedar from her hand. It was light, pale on one side, darkened on the burned end, smooth from being handled. She didn't know where Rosie had found it, and she'd never asked, because the child couldn't answer, and because somehow it hadn't seemed like the most important question. Now, holding it in the canyon where the cattle stood under their double brands, she looked at the burned end and thought about burning, about the branding rack and the branding irons and the way fire could be used to mark things and change things and destroy things, and how sometimes the same fire that took something from you left evidence of what had been done. She closed her hand around the cedar. "Thank you," she said to Rosie. The girl looked at her with those steady eyes. Then she did something she hadn't done once in the 3 days since she'd arrived at Iron Ridge Ranch. She reached out and took Evelyn's free hand, held it, just for a moment, then let go and went back to watching the canyon. Evelyn stood with the cedar in one hand and the warmth of the girl's fingers still in the other, and she looked at Silas Rowan across the canyon floor as Pruitt talked to him in his careful, unhurried way, and she understood that the next hours and days were going to be hard, that Silas would fight this with every resource he had and every favor he was owed and every version of events he could construct, that a canyon full of cattle and a ghost brand and a boot print in ash were not the same as a verdict. But they were the truth, and the truth was something she had that he didn't, and that was the one advantage that had no counter. She held on to that. The sun moved across the top of the canyon walls, and the afternoon light changed color in the way it did in this country, going warm and red toward evening, making everything look simultaneously harsher and more beautiful than it had any right to be. Pruitt continued his careful work. Birch continued writing. The cattle stood in their stolen sanctuary and breathed the canyon air. And somewhere above them, on the road that ran along the ridge, because sound carried strange in Split Rock Canyon, and Evelyn had learned that, she heard a horse going fast, north, away from town. One of Silas's men, she didn't know which one, going somewhere, doing something, setting something in motion that she couldn't see yet. She looked at Cole. He'd heard it too. His jaw was set. "What do you think he's doing?" she said. "Calling in whatever he's got left," Cole said. "Which is?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. But men like him always have something left. You should be ready for that." She thought about the 30-day extension, now down to 27 days. She thought about the appraisal meeting at the hotel. She thought about the way Silas had looked at her that morning in the canyon entrance. Not the managed version, the real one. And what she'd seen in it, not just calculation, something more personal than that, something that had been building for longer than 2 years, possibly longer than she'd been in Harlan at all. A man who wanted a thing that badly didn't stop because the evidence had turned against him. "I know," she said. "I'm ready." She said it the way she'd learned to say things she wasn't entirely certain of, with enough conviction that it became a kind of commitment rather than a claim, something to grow into rather than something already true. The canyon held its silence around them, and the evening came on, and the stolen cattle waited in the last red light. The something Silas had left turned out to be Douglas Fenn, Evelyn found this out the following morning when Fenn arrived at the lease board office before it opened and spent 40 minutes with two of the board members she hadn't been able to read during the yard review, quietly, in the way that political pressure was applied quietly, without fingerprints. She heard about it from the postmaster's wife, who heard it from the woman who cleaned the office, who had been there early to do the floors and had not been asked to leave. What Fenn said in that room, she never learned precisely. But by mid-morning, the mood in Harlan had shifted in the way mood shifted in small towns. Not through any single declaration, but through a series of small adjustments, conversations ending slightly faster, people finding somewhere else to be when she walked into the feed store. As if someone had quietly changed the temperature and everyone had adjusted without acknowledging it. Pruitt was still in the canyon with his deputies, still documenting. She'd ridden out to check at first light, and he was already there, methodical as always, working through the herd animal by animal. He'd nodded at her and told her to stay available and not to discuss the details with anyone until he'd completed his records. She'd agreed and ridden back and spent the morning in a state of suspended tension that she had no productive outlet for. Cole was repairing the section of south fence near the Juniper Gate. Not because it was urgent now, but because it needed doing, and because he was a man who dealt with unspent anxiety by finding physical work to absorb it. She watched him from the kitchen window and thought that they were more alike in that respect than she'd have guessed 3 days ago. Rosie was in the yard. She'd taken an interest in the garden plot along the east wall of the house, not planting, just examining, crouching over the dry soil with her usual focused attention. Evelyn had given her a small trowel in case she wanted to do something with her hands, and the girl had accepted it with a nod and gone back to her investigation. It was Rosie who saw the riders coming from the south road. She stood up from the garden and faced the road and held the trowel at her side, and Evelyn saw her through the window and was already reaching for her jacket when the sound reached the house. Not 2 riders, not 3. More than that. She got to the porch and counted. 6 horses, coming at a canter, and leading them was Silas Rowan with the morning sun at his back and his good jacket on for the second time in a week. Behind him were Cord and the third man from the canyon, and behind them, which was what made her stomach drop, were 3 men she recognized from the county council, not Fenn, but men in Fenn's orbit, men who had attended the same dinner at the hotel, men whose presence here in a group at this hour meant that whatever Silas had set in motion the previous afternoon, it had moved fast. Cole had heard them. He was walking back from the fence line, his tools in one hand, watching the road. Silas pulled up at the yard gate and looked at Evelyn on the porch. "We need to talk," he said. "We're talking right now." "Inside," he said. "Privately." "No." He looked at her for a moment. The smile was back, but it was thinner than it had been, worn at the edges. "Evelyn, I'm trying to offer you, whatever you're offering, you can offer it here," she said, "in the yard, in front of whoever wants to listen." Behind him, the 3 councilmen exchanged a glance. Cord was watching Cole with the careful attention of a man doing a threat assessment. Silas got down from his horse. He came to the gate and rested his hand on the top rail, which was as far as she was going to let him come without an invitation, and they both knew it. "What happened in the canyon yesterday was a misunderstanding," he said. "The cattle drifted, like I told Pruitt. There's a gap in my north fence line that I can document. I can bring 3 men who've seen it. The brands? Are your brands over my husband's brands?" she said. Martin Hale felt it with his hand. Frank Birch wrote it down. "Evelyn." His voice dropped, went patient and careful. "A brand scar is not definitive evidence. Animals carry old marks from previous owners. Cattle change hands, and sometimes the paperwork isn't—" "These cattle never changed hands," she said. "They disappeared from my south pasture in August without a bill of sale, without my knowledge, without any documentation whatsoever. They're in my county records as missing livestock, filed with Frank Birch 6 weeks ago. And they're wearing your iron over my dead husband's mark." She held his gaze. "There's no version of that story that's a misunderstanding." One of the councilmen, a thin-faced man named Garrett Toll, who ran the land title office, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Cross, the council is concerned that this situation is being escalated beyond what the evidence actually—" "Mr. Toll," she said, "with respect, you work for the county. Len Pruitt works for the county. I'd suggest that the county's position on the evidence is something you work out with him, Not with me, in my yard, the morning after he documents it. Toll's mouth closed. Silas looked at her with the real face again. The one under the other one. She was getting to know it now. I have friends on that lease board, he said quietly. Just to her. The councilmen were close enough to hear, but he kept his voice low enough that it had the quality of a private statement. I have friends in the county recorder's office. I have friends who've been in this valley a lot longer than you have, and who have a lot more invested in how things go here. You think finding some cattle in a canyon ends this? It doesn't end this, it makes it uglier. She had to give him credit for that. The honesty of it was almost refreshing after 2 years of the smile. I know it doesn't end it, she said. That's why I didn't try to end it in a canyon with nobody watching. She looked past him at the councilmen, at Cord, at the third man whose name she still didn't know. That's why I brought Martin Hale. Silas stared at her. You're making an enemy, he said. You made yourself one, she said. I just finally started paying attention. He stood there for another moment, hand on the fence rail, and the morning was quiet around them. The horses moving slightly, the sound of the wind off the ridge, Rosie somewhere behind Evelyn in the yard being perfectly still in the way she was when something important was happening. Then Silas stepped back from the gate. We'll see how Pruitt's report reads, he said. Yes, she agreed. We will. He mounted and rode, and the councilmen went with him, and Cord and the third man last, and the sound of them faded south, and Evelyn stood on her porch until it was completely gone. Cole came to stand beside her. That was him seeing how much you'd bend, he said. I know. You didn't bend. No. She went inside. Come help me figure out how to make sure Pruitt's report actually gets heard by the right people before Silas gets to the wrong ones. Oh no. It took 4 more days. 4 days of Pruitt's careful documentation, of Birch's expanding ledger, of Evelyn providing every record she had, purchase receipts, cattle counts, the county vet's report on the 5 animals recorded as wolf depredation, her own handwritten logs going back 18 months. 4 days of Silas being visible around town in the particular way that men with influence were visible when they were worried. At dinners, at the council office, at the feed store counter, everywhere that conversations happened. She heard 3 different versions of his alternate explanation during those 4 days. The cattle had drifted. The brands were pre-existing from a prior sale. There had been a verbal agreement with Marcus, a handshake deal, the kind that wasn't written down, the kind that was very convenient to claim when the other party was 2 years dead. That last one was the one that almost broke something in her. Not because it was persuasive, it wasn't, not to anyone who knew Marcus's habits, which had been meticulous to the point of driving her slightly crazy during their marriage, but because of the particular violation of it. The idea of Silas standing in rooms putting words in her dead husband's mouth, building a fiction from a man who couldn't contradict it. She told Cole about it on the 3rd evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Rosie had gone to sleep. He's using Marcus, she said, as a shield, as a prop in a story Marcus never agreed to be in. Cole looked at his coffee for a moment. Can you prove it's false? The handshake deal? Marcus didn't do verbal agreements for anything over $20, she said. He had a saying, if it's worth doing, it's worth writing down and signing. He used to say it so often it drove me crazy. She stopped, put her hand flat on the table. I gave him grief about it once, said he was paranoid. He said he wasn't paranoid. He was just older than I was, and he'd seen what happened when people trusted the goodwill of other people without the paperwork to back it up. Cole was quiet. He was right, she said. He was right, Cole agreed. She sat with that for a moment. He had a character witness in his own habits, she said slowly. Anyone who knew him in Harlan for any length of time knows he didn't shake on cattle deals. 3 years at the lease board, Hale attended those meetings. He knew Marcus. Then tell Hale that, Cole said, not as a point in your favor, just as a fact about the man Hale knew. She looked at him. That's good, she said. It's not complicated, he said. The truth usually isn't. She went to see Hale the next morning. On the 5th day, Pruitt called a meeting, not in the sheriff's office, that would have been procedurally correct, but limited in audience. Not at the lease board office either. He called it at the canyon itself, which was Evelyn's suggestion relayed through Hale, and which Pruitt had agreed to after a pause that told her he'd been thinking along the same lines. The reasoning was simple, and she'd arrived at it at 3 in the morning on the fourth night, lying awake with the evidence arranged and rearranged in her mind. The canyon was the proof. The cattle were the proof. Descriptions of brands on paper were one thing, but standing in a bowl of rock with 43 animals around you and running your hand over the hide and feeling the old mark under the new one, that was a different kind of knowing, the kind that didn't require interpretation. So Pruitt called his meeting at Split Rock Canyon, and the people who came were Martin Hale and the full lease board, all 6 of them, 3 neighboring ranchers who had their own history with Silas Rowan that Evelyn was only beginning to understand, the county council minus Fenn, who sent his apologies through a third party, Frank Birch with his expanded ledger, and Silas himself, who had the legal right to be present and who arrived last, alone without Cord or the unnamed third man. She noticed that, the alone part. She filed it. Pruitt ran it like a sheriff ran things, without theater, without speeches, with the simple directness of a man who decided what the facts were and was presenting them in sequence. He walked them through the canyon to the hidden bowl. He showed them the juniper gate. He showed them the pressed earth trail along the south fence line. He showed them the leather scraps, now labeled and numbered in Birch's documentation. And then he walked them to the cattle. He'd chosen 3 animals for close examination: an older steer with the clearest ghost brand, a younger heifer whose marks were fresher and required more explanation, and a third animal that Birch had found with a partial ear notch, Marcus's ear notch pattern, the one he'd used for breeding stock, that predated any branding and couldn't have been applied by anyone other than the original owner. One of the neighboring ranchers, a barrel-chested man named Walt Creedy, who'd run cattle in this county for 30 years, crouched beside the older steer and ran his hand over the brand the way Hale had. He stayed there a long time. "That's a cross brand underneath," he said, to no one in particular. "I've seen that iron for years. Know the shape." He stood up and looked at Silas without any particular expression on his face. Silas said, "Walt, don't," Creedy said. Just that. One word, and went back to looking at the cattle. Dorothea Vance, who had been the board member Evelyn trusted least, crouched beside the heifer with her reading glasses on and spent 4 minutes examining the brand in total silence. When she stood up, she adjusted her glasses and looked at Hale. "Martin," she said, "I need you to make sure Frank's got the notch mark in the record." "It's there," Birch said from where he was already writing. Dorothea nodded. She did not look at Silas. It was the quietly devastating version of the end of something. Not a confrontation, not a declaration, just people one by one removing themselves from the position they'd been asked to hold and finding somewhere else to stand. Silas watched it happen. Evelyn watched him watch it. She thought about how this moment might go, had imagined it angry, imagined it loud, imagined accusations and counter-accusations and the messy human business of a man being caught. But he was very still. He stood at the edge of the group with his arms at his sides, and he watched the people who'd been in his corner for 2 years look at the evidence and move, quietly and without ceremony, away from him. She didn't feel satisfied. She kept waiting for satisfaction, and it didn't come. What came instead was a bone-deep exhaustion and something that might eventually become grief, for the years of it, for what had been taken, for Marcus's mark worn like a secret under someone else's iron. Pruitt spoke to Silas. Evelyn was on the other side of the canyon bowl and couldn't hear the specifics, but she watched Silas's face and she watched Pruitt's posture, and she understood the shape of the conversation from the outside. Pruitt asked. Silas answered. Pruitt asked again. The answers got shorter and then stopped being answers at all. Cole was beside her. "It's enough," he said quietly. "What's here?" "It's enough. For the cattle," she said. "For the lease board. I don't know yet if it's enough for the law." "That's Pruitt's job." "I know." He looked at her sideways. "You're not good at letting things be other people's job." "No," she said. "I'm working on it." He made a quiet sound that might have been the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. And then, and she would not have predicted this, could not have staged it if she'd tried, Rosie moved. The girl had been standing at the canyon entrance the whole time, in her usual position, watching with her usual attention. No one had asked her to come further in. No one had introduced her or explained her or paid her much mind, because she was a child and she didn't speak, and the adults had other things demanding their focus. But now she walked forward, through the group, past Hale and Birch and Walt Creedy and Dorothea Vance, past the 3 council members, between the cattle who shifted and let her through, until she reached the older steer, the one Creedy had examined, the one with the clearest ghost brand, and put her small hand on its flank. Everyone was watching her now. She looked at the brand. Then she looked at Silas Rowan across the canyon bowl. Her dark eyes found his face and held it, and Evelyn was reminded of the first morning when she'd looked at Silas from across the yard. Steady, direct, without the need to flinch that adults sometimes had. Silas looked back at her. Something happened in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. She didn't think Silas Rowan had the particular equipment for guilt, but something. The recognition of being seen by something too simple and too clear to argue with. And then Rosie did what she hadn't done in 3 years. She spoke. One word, quiet. In the hush of the canyon, it carried to everyone present without her having to raise her voice. Hers, she said. Her hand was still on the steer's flank. Her eyes were still on Silas. The canyon was so quiet after that word that Evelyn could hear the seep water moving in the far wall. Cole made a sound beside her, something that wasn't a word, something that came from somewhere below words. She glanced at him, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were wet, and he was staring at his daughter with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for so long that when it finally arrives, he doesn't know where to put it. Walt Creedy cleared his throat. Dorothea Vance took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Martin Hale looked at Rosie for a long moment, then at Evelyn. Then he said, Frank, make sure you've got all of this. I've got it, Birch said. His voice was slightly rough. All of it. Silas left the canyon before Pruitt formally concluded the meeting. He simply walked to his horse at the entrance and mounted and rode north, and no one stopped him, because Pruitt knew where to find him, and Silas knew that Pruitt knew. And some endings happened that way. Not in a moment of confrontation, but in a man calculating what was left and finding the number too small to fight. Pruitt would file his report with the county attorney. The process from there would be slow and imperfect, and there would be moments when the outcome felt uncertain, because that was the nature of law in a small county where influence moved like water through the cracks of every institution. Evelyn understood that, but the canyon had 23 witnesses and a 7-year-old girl's single word and 43 animals wearing the evidence on their skin, and that was the kind of truth that didn't need her to keep holding it up. It could stand on its own now. She walked to Cole. He was still watching Rosie, who was still standing beside the old steer with her hand on its flank, looking at the place where Silas had been. Cole, Evelyn said. He looked at her. His eyes were dry now, but the expression underneath was still raw. She's all right, Evelyn said. Not because she was certain, because it was what he needed to hear from someone outside himself, and because everything she'd seen in 3 days suggested it was probably true. He nodded, pressed his mouth into a line, nodded again. Rosie took her hand off the steer and walked back toward them. She stopped in front of her father and looked up at him, and he crouched down to her level, and they looked at each other for a long moment in that particular language they had that required nothing Evelyn could hear. Then Rosie leaned forward and put her head briefly against his shoulder. He put one hand on her back, gently, and closed his eyes for just a second. Evelyn looked away. Gave them that. The canyon held its silence around all of them. The cattle and the witnesses and the documented truth and the slowly settling dust of a long-running wrong that had finally been brought into the light where it couldn't pretend anymore to be anything other than what it was. It wasn't over. There was still the lease board decision, still the county attorney, still the long administrative process of claiming back what had been taken. But the hiding was done. The secret gate in the juniper trees had been found and walked through and documented and witnessed, and no one was going back to pretending it wasn't there. That at least was finished. And sometimes finished was enough. The county attorney's name was Harold Voss, and he was not a fast man. Evelyn had known this going in. Voss had been practicing law in Harlan County for 26 years, and he had developed in that time the particular deliberateness of a man who had seen what happened when things moved too quickly. Corners cut, details missed, cases built on momentum rather than foundation that then collapsed at the precise worst moment.
He was thorough to the point of being maddening, and she made her peace with that in the first week and reminded herself of it every day of the 2 weeks that followed. Pruitt's report went to Voss on a Thursday. Voss spent 4 days reading it before he called anyone. Then he called Birch, then Hale, then Evelyn, then the 3 neighboring ranchers who'd been in the canyon, separately, methodically, asking the same questions in slightly different orders the way experienced lawyers did to check whether the answers stayed consistent. They did. Silas had retained a lawyer from outside the county, a man named Aldrich, who came up from the Southern Territories with a leather briefcase and a reputation for making evidence look ambiguous. Evelyn had heard the name from Walt Creedy, who'd heard it from someone else, and she'd spent one bad evening imagining all the ways a skilled lawyer could re-narrate what had been in that canyon. The drifting cattle explanation, the alleged verbal agreement with Marcus, the suggestion that the ghost brands were artifact rather than evidence. She'd gone to bed that night with all of it unresolved and woken up the next morning and done what she always did. Made coffee, went outside, walked the fence line. Because she had learned over 2 years that the work was the only honest answer to the things she couldn't control. The fence didn't care what Aldrich's reputation was. The cattle needed water regardless of what arguments were being constructed in a lawyer's office somewhere south of Harlan. Cole had stayed. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't announced it. He'd simply continued doing what he'd been doing since the first morning, fixing what was broken, checking what needed checking, being present without requiring anything from her in exchange for it. She'd come out one morning to find he'd started rebuilding the branding rack. Not from scratch. He'd salvaged what iron frame had survived the burning and built the new structure around it, so the old bones were still in there, just with new wood around them. She'd stood looking at it for a long minute before she could say anything. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "It needed doing," he said. "You could have built a new one from scratch. Started fresh." He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. The frame was still good, he said. Seemed wasteful. She looked at the rack, at the old iron bones inside the new construction. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." Rosie had spoken 4 more times in the 2 weeks since the canyon. Not freely, not easily. Each word came out like something retrieved from a great depth, and she seemed tired after, in the way of someone who had used a muscle that had been still too long. But they came. Small things, practical things. Water when she was thirsty, cold when the morning was sharp. Once, sitting at the kitchen table while Evelyn was working through her documentation for Voss, the girl had looked at the papers spread across the table and said a lot, which was accurate enough that Evelyn had laughed, genuinely, not politely, and Rosie had looked briefly startled and then made a small expression that might have been the preliminary stages of a smile. Cole had watched all of this from his usual position of stillness, and Evelyn had watched him watching, and she thought about what it meant to wait 3 years for someone you loved to come back from somewhere you couldn't follow them, about the particular loneliness of that. She'd had her own version of it, not the same. Grief and silence were different countries, but adjacent enough that she thought she understood the shape of it, even if not the specifics. She didn't say any of this to Cole. They were not people who said those kinds of things easily, but she thought it, and she let it inform how she moved around them both. And maybe that was enough. Voss called her into his office on a Tuesday morning in early November, 3 weeks and 2 days after Pruitt's report had been filed. She sat across his desk in the chair that smelled of old leather, and waited while he arranged his papers in the particular sequence he preferred before speaking. Outside his window, the main street of Harlan was going about its morning. Wagon wheels on dry ground, someone's dog crossing the road, the sound of the grain mill starting up on the south end of town. "Mrs. Cross," Voss said. He folded his hands on the desk. "I've completed my review of Sheriff Pruitt's report and the supporting documentation from Mr. Birch's records." "Yes, sir." "I want to be direct with you about what the law can and can't do here, because I think you deserve the straight version." She didn't say anything, kept her hands still in her lap. "What Pruitt found in Split Rock Canyon is significant. The rebranding evidence is solid, particularly in combination with the leather scraps, the access point documentation, and the witness accounts. The original brand scars have been independently confirmed by 3 experienced cattlemen who testified to recognizing the cross iron." He paused. "That gives us a strong foundation for livestock theft charges against Silas Rowan." "But," she said, "but," he unfolded his hands,
Aldrich is going to argue that the physical evidence doesn't prove Silas's direct involvement, that cattle can be moved and branded without the knowledge of the brand's owner. It's a standard defense, and it has merit as an argument even when it's not true. The question is whether we have enough to counter it. Do we? Voss was quiet for a moment. Cord talked, he said. She went very still.
Len Pruitt had a long conversation with him 2 days ago. Cord's been with Silas for 6 years, and he's made the calculation that 6 years of loyalty isn't worth the weight of what he's looking at if this goes to a full criminal proceeding. Voss looked at her steadily. He gave Pruitt dates, locations, and specifics, including the fact that the branding rack at Iron Ridge was burned on Silas's instruction by Cord himself, with the intent to create evidence suggesting mismanagement or criminal activity by you.
The room was quiet. Evelyn thought about the ash pile, about standing in it at dawn with her hands steady and her mind already moving, about the boot print with the star-shaped repair that she'd recognized and documented and taken to Hale before Silas could decide what it meant. What does that mean for the charges? She said.
It means we have a cooperating witness with direct knowledge. It significantly changes the calculus. Voss picked up a paper. Aldrich received notice this morning. I expect the defense posture will shift considerably in the next few days. Is Cord going to be all right? She said. Voss looked at her over the paper. The question seemed to land differently than he'd expected.
He committed a crime on that property, she said. I know that. But he's also the reason the rest of it holds. I want to know if the law is going to bury him for doing the right thing eventually. Voss set the paper down. Pruitt is recommending leniency given the cooperation. I'm inclined to agree. She nodded. Good. Mrs. Cross. He leaned forward slightly. I want to say something that's outside my professional role here, which you can take or leave as you choose. Go ahead.
What you built. The documentation, the evidence trail, bringing Hale into the canyon with witnesses before anyone could disturb it. Most people in your position wouldn't have thought to do that. Most people would have ridden to the sheriff first and lost half the evidentiary value in the process. He looked at her directly. You built a case before you knew you were building one. That's not luck. That's discipline. She thought about Marcus's saying, if it's worth doing, it's worth writing down. Thought about 2 years of learning the hard way that the people who wanted what you had were always better prepared for the fight than you expected. And the only answer to that was to be more prepared than they anticipated. I learned it from someone, she said. Voss nodded. The lease board meets Thursday, he said. Given the current state of the evidence and Cord's testimony, I don't anticipate any challenge to your continued management, but I wanted you to hear it from me first rather than from the meeting. She sat with that for a moment. Thursday was 2 days away. 2 days until the board made it official. 2 days until the piece of paper that had been held over her head for 3 weeks was signed and filed and done.
Thank you, Harold, she said. He made a small sound of acknowledgement and picked up his next file, which was his version of a warm farewell, and she got up and went out into the main street of Harlan and stood in the thin November sunlight for a moment, just standing, not needing to be anywhere for the first time in 3 weeks. The lease board meeting on Thursday was nothing like the first one. That first meeting had been held in her yard under the pressure of a noon deadline, with Silas at Hale's shoulder and the weight of 2 years of doubt sitting on every word she said. This one was held in the board's office on the second floor of the county building, at a table, with chairs. Birch had his ledger. Hale had his coffee. The other board members were present and attentive in the way people were attentive when they understood that what they'd almost done 3 weeks ago required a certain reckoning with themselves. Dorothea Vance was the one who surprised her. At the end of the session, after the formal vote, after Hale had read the determination into the record, after Birch had prepared the paperwork, Dorothea waited while the others filed out and then came to stand beside Evelyn at the table. I want to say something, she said. All right, Evelyn said. I was wrong. She said it without preamble, without softening. Not about the evidence. I didn't have the evidence to be right or wrong about, but I was wrong in the way I approached your situation from the beginning. I treated you as a problem to be managed rather than a manager to be evaluated. She met Evelyn's eyes. That's not the same thing, and I knew the difference, and I made the easier choice. Evelyn looked at her. Dorothea Vance was 63 years old, and had been on this board for 12 years and had probably made 100 small accommodations to the way things worked in Harlan that had added up over time to this one larger failure. That was how it usually went. Not one dramatic decision, but a sequence of smaller ones that each seemed reasonable in the moment. "I appreciate you saying so," Evelyn said. "I'm not asking for anything," Dorothea said. "I'm not asking you to say it's all right because it wasn't. I just wanted it said." "All right," Evelyn said. "It's said." Dorothea nodded once and left. Evelyn stood at the table alone for a minute, the paperwork in front of her. The determination of the board, signed by all 6 members including Dorothea, confirming Iron Ridge Ranch's operational lease in the name of Evelyn Cross, sole manager, for a renewed term of 10 years. She picked up the pen, her name in her own handwriting, on her own land, in her own right. She'd thought this moment might feel like something enormous, like the end of something that had taken everything she had. And it did. But it also felt smaller than she'd imagined, more ordinary, because the truth was that the moment she'd understood she was going to fight, really understood it, down in the place where decisions actually got made, had been 3 weeks ago in her kitchen doorway, looking at a drifter on a horse who was patient enough to wait at her gate without pushing through. The pen went down. The paper went into the ledger. Frank Birch filed it without ceremony. She walked out of the county building into the November afternoon and found Cole sitting on the bench outside with Rosie beside him, the girl drawing something in the dust with the toe of her boot. He looked up when she came out and read her face and didn't ask the question. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. Rosie looked up from her dust drawing. She looked at Evelyn for a moment, and then she said, "Good." Simple. Direct. The word of someone who had been following the arc of the story with full attention and had reached her own conclusion. Cole looked at his daughter and then back at Evelyn, and there was something in his face that she'd started to recognize over the past 3 weeks. Something that had nothing to do with the ranch, or the legal situation, or the work. Something quieter than all of that. She didn't address it directly. Not yet. Some things needed their own time. "Come on," she said. "There's fence to check before dark." Walt Creedy brought 4 men on Saturday morning, and they spent the day finishing the east fence line. He brought wire and posts and didn't mention payment, and when Evelyn tried to bring it up, he looked at her the way old ranchers looked at things they considered settled, and she let it go. 2 other neighbors came in the afternoon. A woman named June Hartley, who ran the small operation north of the Canyon Road, and her husband Pete, who knew how to work cedar and spent 3 hours improving the structural integrity of Cole's rebuilt branding rack with a competence that made the whole thing look like it had been planned that way from the start. Nobody made speeches. Nobody talked about what had happened with Silas except in the margins. A sentence here, a reference there. The way frontier people process things they'd witnessed, which was sideways and practical, and generally focused on what needed doing next rather than what had already been done. Evelyn fed all of them at noon. It was too many people for her kitchen, so they ate in the yard, which was cold enough that everyone stood close to the fire Cole had built in the stone ring near the barn. She made biscuits that were slightly overdone on the bottom because she was managing too many things at once, and nobody mentioned it, which was its own kind of kindness. Rosie moved through the group with a quiet ease that surprised Evelyn until she realized it shouldn't have. The girl had been reading people from the moment she arrived, reading them carefully, reading them right. She knew who was safe and who wasn't, and she made her judgments without sentimentality and acted on them without second-guessing. June Hartley sat with her for 20 minutes near the fire after lunch, and they talked. Rosie in her new tentative way, June with the patient attention of someone used to listening to things that came slowly. And Evelyn watched from the kitchen doorway and thought about what it meant to find your voice in a place where someone had finally earned the right to hear it. The afternoon light came down long and gold across the yard, across the repaired fence line and the rebuilt branding rack and the horses in the paddock, and the people eating slightly overdone biscuits and talking about the coming winter and the state of the North Road and the price of wire at the Harlan Supply Depot. Ordinary things. The kind of things that only felt ordinary if you hadn't spent 2 years watching them slowly get taken from you. Silas Rowan's formal charges were filed the following Monday. Evelyn heard about it through Pruitt, who stopped by the ranch on his way south. The charges were significant: livestock theft, destruction of property, conspiracy,
and several others that Voss had added based on Cord's testimony. Aldrich was still representing him, but the defense posture had shifted in exactly the direction Voss had predicted. It would go to a proper hearing in the spring. It would be slow and imperfect, and there would be days when the outcome felt uncertain. She understood that. She'd made her peace with the gap between finding the truth and seeing it fully adjudicated, because the gap was real, and pretending otherwise would only make it harder. What she knew, what she held on to, was that the question of who managed Iron Ridge Ranch had been settled. The cattle were back on her pasture, the records corrected. The original brands redocumented in Birch's ledger. The work of reclaiming the ground that had been taken from her was ongoing and would be for a while because 2 years of neglect and deliberate undermining didn't reverse in 3 weeks. But it was her work now, hers to do on her own terms, at her own pace, with the people she chose around her. That was not a small thing. On the last evening of November, after the neighbors had come and gone and the fence was done and the yard was quiet again, Evelyn sat on the porch steps with her coffee and watched the last light leave the sky. Cole came out of the barn and stopped in the yard, looking at the same sky, and after a moment he came and sat on the steps below her, 1 step down, which was where he always sat when they talked out here, which was a small thing but a considered one. They sat in silence for a while. The silence between them had changed over the weeks. In the beginning, it had been the silence of 2 strangers being careful with each other. Now it was something else. Not comfortable exactly, because there were still things unsaid, but honest. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled to be worthwhile. "You're going to stay," she said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "If that's all right." "It's all right." She looked at her coffee. "I want to say something, and I want to say it once and clearly so there's no confusion about it." "Okay." "This is my ranch," she said. Mine. Not ours, not yours, not anyone's, but mine. That's not going to change, and I'm not looking for it to change." "I know that," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to take over something. I'm not looking for someone to rescue something either. I already did that part." She looked at him. "I'm just telling you what it is, so you can decide if you can live with it." Cole looked at the dark ridgeline for a moment. "I came through your gate 3 weeks ago with a broke-down horse and a kid who hadn't spoken in 3 years, he said. "I'm not under any illusions about what I have to offer a woman who just built a legal case from scratch and faced down a land grab by herself." He paused. "I can work. I can stay where I'm put. I'm not going to try to own something that isn't mine." He turned and looked at her. "That's what it is from my side, if you want the clear version." She looked at him. "That'll do," she said. He nodded. Looked back at the ridge. Rosie's light was still on in the spare room. She'd been given a proper bed now. Evelyn had moved things around to make the spare room hers, a decision that had been made without a formal conversation and had become simply true. Through the window, Evelyn could see the girl's shadow moving, still awake, still thinking, still reading whatever world she found inside her own head. She thought about what Rosie had said in the canyon. 1 word, spoken into complete silence, with her hand on the flank of a stolen animal and her eyes on the man who'd stolen it. Hers. Not justice, not accusation, not even argument. Just the plain statement of what was true, delivered by someone with no stake in the outcome except the truth itself. And somehow it had landed harder than everything else combined, harder than the ghost brands and the leather scraps and the boot print and the legal documentation, because it was so utterly without strategy. Children didn't understand the chess game. They just looked at a thing and said what they saw. Evelyn thought that was maybe what had been missing from her own approach for the first 1.5 years after Marcus died. That plain directness. She'd been so busy calculating how things would be received, so preoccupied with managing perceptions and working around Silas's influence and anticipating his next move, that she'd sometimes lost track of the simplest version of what was true. She'd found it eventually, or it had found her, or maybe having Cole and Rosie around had reflected something back at her that she'd needed to see. She didn't know which it was. Probably some of all of them. The branding rack stood in the east yard, visible from the porch, its new wood pale against the dark. The old iron frame inside it, the part Marcus had built, showed at the joints where the wood met it, darker, seasoned, holding the new structure the way old things sometimes held new ones, giving them something to build against. She thought about Marcus saying if it's worth doing, it's worth writing down. Thought about everything she'd written down in the past 3 weeks. Thought about the documents in the tin box under the bedroom floor, the deed and the letter and the pocket watch, and now the renewed lease with her own name at the bottom, signed in her own hand. She thought about what it cost to stay in a place. Not financially. She understood that arithmetic well enough. But the other cost. The one you paid in mornings where you got up before light and did the work before you were ready to do it, in winters where the isolation pressed in like weather, and the particular loneliness of carrying something that no one else could carry for you. She'd paid that for 2 years and would pay it for years to come because that was the nature of the thing she'd chosen. It was hard, and it was hers, and she was not willing to give it up for comfort or convenience or anyone's idea of what made sense for a woman in her position. The frontier had not been kind to her. It had taken her husband and tried to take her land and had spent 2 years working on her reputation with the quiet persistence of water-finding cracks. But it had also given her this, the knowledge of what she was made of. Not the knowledge she'd had before Marcus died, the assumption of it, the untested belief that she was capable and strong and would manage whatever came. The real knowledge, the kind that came from actually going through something and discovering that you were still standing on the other side. That was worth something. It was worth exactly as much as it had cost, which was considerable. Cole stood up from the step below her. "Cold," he said. "Yes." He went inside. She stayed. She sat with her cold coffee and the dark ridge and the pale new wood of the branding rack and the light still on in Rosie's window, and she felt the ranch around her the way she used to feel it in those first quiet mornings with Marcus. The breathing of it, the particular aliveness of a piece of land that had been worked and cared for and was returning the investment slowly, in its own time, on its own terms. Iron Ridge Ranch. Her name on the lease. Her work in the ground. Her future, unwritten and unremarkable and completely hers. She wasn't going anywhere. She got up off the steps, took her cold coffee inside, and closed the door.